They say revenge is a dish best served cold. What they don't tell you is that sometimes it serves itself, hot and immediate, in the form of cascading system failures during the busiest hours of the busiest day of the year. I learned that lesson on a Friday evening in November, watching server dashboards turn red while my former employer's e-commerce platform burned to the ground. Black Friday, the day that could make or break a retailer's entire quarter, and their systems were collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. Somewhere in that chaos was code I'd written, architecture I'd designed, systems I'd built over 4 years of nights and weekends. Code they'd decided they could maintain without me. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I used to be the lead platform engineer at Vertex Commerce, one of the largest e-commerce infrastructure providers in the country. We powered the back end for over 200 online retailers, handling everything from inventory management to payment processing to the critical last-mile logistics that got packages to doorsteps. During peak season, our systems processed $3 billion in transactions. During Black Friday specifically, that number doubled. I built the core of those systems. Not alone, I had a team, had collaborators, had people smarter than me working on specific components. But the architecture was mine. The scaling logic that let us handle traffic spikes without melting down. The failover protocols that kept us running when individual servers died. The monitoring systems that caught problems before they became catastrophes. 4 years of my life poured into infrastructure that most people never saw but everyone depended on. The invisible plumbing that made modern commerce possible. And then Marcus Webb decided I was expendable. Marcus was our CTO, had been for about 18 months when everything fell apart. He'd come from a competitor, hired with great fanfare to modernize our technology culture and drive innovation across the platform. What that actually meant was replacing experienced engineers with cheaper contractors, cutting the infrastructure budget to make his quarterly numbers look good, and taking credit for work that had been done years before he arrived. I'd tried to work with him, had presented data showing that our systems needed investment, not cuts, had explained, patiently and then less patiently, that the architecture I'd built required ongoing maintenance, that technical debt was accumulating, that we were one bad traffic spike away from serious problems. He'd smiled and nodded and done nothing, or worse than nothing. He'd accelerated the cuts, laid off 2 of my best engineers, and started talking about transitioning to a more agile infrastructure model, which seemed to mean hoping nothing broke while spending as little as possible. The breaking point came in September, 2 months before Black Friday. Marcus called me into his office. Corner space, views of the city, furniture that cost more than my annual bonus, and told me the company was going in a different direction with its platform architecture. "We've engaged a consulting firm to evaluate our systems," he said, in that particular tone executives use when they've already made a decision and are just going through the motions of explaining it. "They'll be providing recommendations for modernization. Your role will be transitioning to a more advisory capacity during this process." Advisory capacity, the corporate euphemism for being sidelined while someone else took over your work. "What consulting firm?" I asked. "Nexus Digital. They specialize in cloud-native architectures, very cutting edge." I knew Nexus Digital. They were the flavor-of-the-month consulting shop that charged premium rates to tell companies what they wanted to hear. Their cloud-native expertise mostly consisted of recommending expensive migrations that looked good in presentations, but rarely survived contact with real-world complexity. "Marcus, Black Friday is 2 months away. This is the worst possible time to bring in outside consultants to mess with core infrastructure. They won't be messing with anything. They'll be evaluating and recommending. Implementation would happen after the peak season. And what's my role during this evaluation? Knowledge transfer, documentation, making sure Nexus has everything they need to understand our systems." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, the mask slipping slightly to reveal what was underneath. "I'll be honest with you, Daniel. The board is asking questions about why we're so dependent on legacy systems and legacy personnel. They want to see a path to modernization that doesn't require keeping expensive senior engineers on staff indefinitely." Legacy personnel. That's what I was now. Not the person who'd built the systems that generated billions in revenue. Legacy personnel to be deprecated like outdated code. "You're going to fire me," I said, not a question. "I'm going to transition your role to something more sustainable for the organization. Whether you choose to stay through that transition is up to you." I chose not to stay. Gave my 2 weeks notice the next day, documented what I could in the time I had, and walked out of Vertex Commerce with 4 years of institutional knowledge that couldn't be captured in any handoff document. The knowledge transfer was a joke. 2 weeks to explain systems I'd spent 4 years building, to consultants who didn't understand the first thing about high-availability e-commerce infrastructure. They asked the wrong questions, documented the wrong things, focused on the architecture diagrams while ignoring the operational nuances that actually kept everything running. I tried to warn them, sat in meetings explaining that our scaling logic had specific timing dependencies, that the failover protocols required manual verification steps that weren't in any runbook, that the monitoring systems I'd built needed constant tuning to distinguish real problems from false alarms. I explained that the load balancer configurations had been hand-tuned over 2 years of production experience, that the database sharding strategy required careful coordination during traffic spikes, that the caching layer had particular invalidation patterns that looked inefficient but prevented subtle data corruption bugs we'd discovered the hard way. They nodded and took notes and clearly didn't understand any of it. The lead consultant, a woman named Jennifer who had impressive credentials but had never actually operated a system at our scale, kept asking questions that revealed how little she understood about what we'd built. "Why don't you just use auto-scaling?" she asked, as if the problems we'd solved were simple, as if 4 years of engineering judgment could be replaced by checking a box in a cloud console. I tried to explain that auto-scaling wasn't magic, that it had latency and cost implications, that our custom solution had been built because the off-the-shelf options didn't meet our specific requirements. She wrote something in her notebook and moved on to the next question on her list. Neither did Marcus understand any of it. He sat in on a few sessions with the glazed expression of someone who'd already decided the outcome and was just waiting for the process to finish. Once, when I was explaining a particularly subtle aspect of our transaction processing pipeline, he actually pulled out his phone and started scrolling through emails. The message couldn't have been clearer. This was a formality, not a genuine attempt to preserve institutional knowledge. I documented everything I could anyway, wrote detailed runbooks for scenarios I'd handled over the years, created annotated architecture diagrams with notes about why things were built the way they were, recorded videos walking through operational procedures, talking to the camera as if someone might actually watch them and learn something. I don't know if anyone ever did. The documentation went into a wiki somewhere, probably never to be accessed until the moment when someone desperately needed the information it contained and couldn't find it fast enough. My last day was October 1st. I cleaned out my desk, said goodbye to the colleagues who'd survived the layoffs, and walked out into autumn sunshine that felt like freedom and failure in equal measure. Rachel hugged me in the parking lot, told me she was sorry, told me she'd keep in touch. We both knew the systems were in trouble, that Black Friday was coming, that everything I'd warned about was still going to happen. "Be careful," I told her. "When things get bad, and they will, don't let them blame you for failures that were baked in before you had any power to prevent them." "I know," she said. "I've already started documenting everything. Emails showing what I recommended and what was approved. CYA files. Smart woman. That's what it had come to. An engineering team so demoralized that they were building paper trails to protect themselves from the inevitable disaster. Not fixing the problems because they didn't have the authority or the resources. Just documenting that they'd seen it coming. The next 6 weeks I did what unemployed engineers do. Updated my resume, talked to recruiters, interviewed at companies that seemed interested in my experience but moved slowly on actually making offers. I had savings, enough to last 6 months if I was careful, but the uncertainty was corrosive, eating at my confidence in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself second-guessing decisions I'd made years ago, wondering if I'd been wrong about the architecture, wrong about the approach, wrong about all of it. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the systems were legacy, outdated, ready to be replaced by whatever modern solution the consultants would recommend. Maybe I was just another aging engineer who couldn't adapt to new paradigms. But then I'd think about the metrics, about the uptime we'd maintained, the traffic we'd handled, the problems we'd prevented through careful engineering and constant vigilance. Those weren't legacy results. Those were world-class results, achieved with systems I'd designed and a team I'd built. The doubt wasn't coming from evidence. It was coming from unemployment, from rejection, from the corrosive effect of having my value questioned by people who didn't understand what they were questioning. I tried not to think about Vertex, about the systems I'd built, the team I'd left behind, the disaster I could see coming but couldn't prevent. It wasn't my problem anymore. I'd warned them, documented what I could, given them every chance to avoid what was coming, but I still had alerts set up on my phone, still had access to the public-facing status pages that showed system health, still couldn't quite let go of something I'd poured 4 years of my life into. Black Friday arrived with the inexorable certainty of a train wreck in slow motion. I woke up early that morning, the way I had every Black Friday for the past 4 years, body conditioned to expect the stress of peak traffic, mind already running through the systems that would be under maximum load. I made coffee, opened my laptop, pulled up the Vertex status page out of habit more than anything else. Everything looked green, normal, the calm before the storm. Traffic started building around 6 a.m. Pacific time, as early bird shoppers on the East Coast began hunting for deals. The status page stayed green. Maybe they'd figured it out. Maybe the consultants had actually learned something. Maybe I'd been wrong about everything. By 9 a.m., traffic was at 150% of normal levels and climbing. The status page flickered, a brief yellow warning about elevated response times, then back to green. Normal for Black Friday. Nothing to worry about. 10:47 a.m., the first real alert appeared: payment processing delays. Transaction timeouts increasing. The status page went yellow, then orange as more systems started showing stress. I watched it happen in real time, refreshing the page every few seconds, feeling something complicated in my chest. Vindication and horror and guilt all mixed together. I'd built those systems, I'd warned them, and now I was watching them fail. By 11:15, the status page was solid red. Major outage, payment processing offline, inventory systems returning errors. The entire platform grinding to a halt during the most critical shopping hours of the year. My phone started buzzing. Text from Rachel, one of my former team members who'd survived the layoffs. "It's bad, really bad. Marcus is losing his mind." Then another text. "They're asking if anyone knows how to reach you." I stared at that message for a long time. They wanted my help. After firing me, after ignoring my warnings, after treating me like legacy personnel to be deprecated, they wanted me to save them. I didn't respond. The outage lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes. I know because I watched every minute of it, tracking the status page updates, reading the increasingly desperate messages on the Vertex Twitter account. We're aware of issues affecting some transactions. Our team is working around the clock. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your patience. 4 hours and 23 minutes during the peak shopping day of the year. I did rough calculations in my head. Based on normal Black Friday traffic, that outage cost their clients somewhere between $50 and $100 million in lost sales. Sales that went to competitors that wouldn't come back, that represented permanent damage to relationships Vertex had spent years building. When the systems finally came back online, I got another text from Rachel. They found the problem. Scaling logic failed. The timing dependencies you warned about. Nexus had optimized them without understanding what they did. The timing dependencies. The exact thing I'd spent 3 meetings trying to explain. The exact thing the consultants had nodded about and clearly not understood. I should have felt vindicated. Should have felt the satisfaction of being proven right. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired and sad and somehow responsible, even though none of it was my fault. The aftermath was brutal. Vertex lost 11 clients in the 2 weeks following Black Friday. Retailers who'd watched their biggest sales day collapse and decided they couldn't risk it happening again. Some of them had been with Vertex for 5 years or more, had built their entire e-commerce infrastructure around our platform. They walked away anyway, accepting the pain of migration rather than the risk of another catastrophic failure. The remaining clients demanded compensation, demanded explanations, demanded assurances that nothing like this would happen again. Emergency calls were scheduled, executives were flown in, promises were made that everyone knew might not be kept. The legal team was working around the clock on liability assessments, trying to figure out how much the company might owe and to whom. Internal investigations were launched. Blame was being assigned, or more accurately, was being distributed in patterns that had more to do with political power than actual responsibility. The consultants from Nexus Digital pointed fingers at the legacy architecture they'd inherited. The remaining engineering team pointed at the changes the consultants had made. Marcus pointed at everyone except himself. I followed it all through Rachel's texts and through industry gossip that filtered back to me through former colleagues. The picture that emerged was exactly what I'd predicted. Systems failing because the people maintaining them didn't understand them. Fixes making things worse because they were based on assumptions rather than knowledge. A cascade of decisions that turned a recoverable problem into a company-threatening crisis. Marcus Webb was gone within a month. Pursuing other opportunities, according to the press release. But everyone knew he'd been pushed out by a board that was looking for someone to blame. The Nexus Digital contract was terminated with prejudice, though I heard they tried to keep their consulting fee anyway, arguing that they'd delivered what was contracted even if the results were catastrophic. And I got a phone call from Gregory Ashworth, Vertex's CEO, a call I'd never expected and didn't particularly want. "Daniel," he said, and his voice had that particular quality of someone who's been humbled and is trying to figure out how to ask for something without admitting how badly they need it. "I owe you an apology, several apologies actually. That's not necessary." "It is. I let Marcus make decisions about technology that I didn't understand well enough to evaluate. I trusted the consultants over the person who'd actually built our systems. That was a mistake that cost this company and our clients enormously. I didn't say anything. Didn't need to." The silence spoke for itself. "I'd like to discuss bringing you back," Gregory continued. "Not in your old role, in a senior leadership position, VP of Platform Engineering, reporting directly to me. Full authority over infrastructure decisions, budget to rebuild what we need, equity stake that reflects your importance to the company. It was everything I'd wanted a year ago. Recognition, authority, the chance to build something without interference from executives who didn't understand what they were managing. I need to think about it," I said. "Of course, take whatever time you need. But Daniel, I want you to know that I understand now. What you built, what we lost when you left, what it would mean to have you back. This isn't just about fixing the immediate problem. It's about making sure we never make this mistake again." I did think about it. Spent 2 weeks considering the offer, talking to people I trusted, trying to figure out what I actually wanted. Part of me wanted to go back. The systems I'd built were still there, wounded but recoverable. The team I'd worked with was still there, demoralized but capable. There was satisfaction in the idea of fixing what had been broken, of proving that the architecture I'd designed could work if properly maintained. But another part of me remembered the meetings where Marcus had dismissed my concerns, the consultants who'd nodded without understanding, the 2 weeks of knowledge transfer that had been treated as a formality rather than a genuine attempt to preserve institutional knowledge. They hadn't valued me when they had me. They only valued me now because my absence had cost them $100 million. I made a different choice. "I appreciate the offer," I told Gregory in our follow-up call, "but I'm not coming back to Vertex, not as VP, not in any capacity." "Can I ask why?" "Because you're offering me the position you should have given me a year ago. Before Marcus, before the consultants, before you decided that experienced engineers were legacy personnel to be optimized away." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "I built those systems, Gregory. I warned you they needed maintenance, needed investment, needed the people who understood them, and I was ignored, sidelined, and eventually pushed out. Now you want me back because you've learned the hard way that I was right, but I've learned something too." "What's that?" "That I don't want to work for people who only value expertise after they've destroyed it, who only respect institutional knowledge after they've lost it. The next time you hire someone to build something critical, maybe you'll remember what happened when you treated that person as expendable." I hung up before he could respond. The story didn't end there, of course. Stories like this never really end. They just transition into new phases, new complications, new opportunities. I started consulting 3 months after leaving Vertex. Not for them, I'd meant what I said about not going back, but for other companies that had heard what happened and wanted to avoid the same fate. Companies that understood, at least theoretically, that the people who built their systems were as important as the systems themselves. My first client was a mid-sized e-commerce company that had been considering the same modernization approach that had destroyed Vertex. They'd hired the same consulting firm, had been given the same recommendations about cloud-native architectures and reduced dependence on legacy personnel. "What would you do differently?" their CEO asked me during our initial meeting. "I'd cancel the Nexus contract immediately," I said. "Their recommendations are generic. They don't account for the specific characteristics of your platform or the institutional knowledge your team has accumulated. You can modernize without burning everything down, but it requires working with your existing engineers, not around them. They're expensive consultants. They came highly recommended. They were expensive consultants at Vertex too. Ask them how Black Friday went." She canceled the contract, hired me instead, at a fraction of what she'd been paying Nexus, to help her team build a modernization roadmap that actually made sense for their specific situation. We did it over 6 months, incrementally, without ever taking the platform offline or losing the knowledge that made it work. Word spread. Within a year, I had more clients than I could handle, all of them companies that had heard the Vertex story and wanted someone who understood the difference between theoretical best practices and practical reality. I built a consulting practice around that understanding, not just technical architecture, but knowledge management, helping companies recognize the value of what their experienced people knew, building systems to capture and transfer that knowledge, creating cultures that valued expertise instead of viewing it as an obstacle to efficiency. It wasn't revenge exactly. I didn't set out to compete with Nexus Digital, or to destroy Marcus Webb's career, or to prove that Gregory Ashworth had made a mistake. But the market had a way of sorting these things out. Companies that understood the value of institutional knowledge thrived. Companies that treated their experts as expendable legacy personnel eventually learned the cost of that approach. Vertex survived, barely. They hired a new CTO, someone with actual infrastructure experience, someone who understood that you couldn't just optimize away the people who knew how things worked. They rebuilt the team, invested in the systems, spent 2 years recovering from a single 4-hour outage that had cost them more than a decade of cost-cutting had saved. I heard from Rachel occasionally, updates on how things were going. The culture was better now, she said. People were valued, expertise was respected. The lessons of Black Friday had been genuinely learned. I was glad for her, for all of them. But I didn't regret my choice to stay away. Some lessons you can only learn by living through them. Vertex had lived through theirs. I'd lived through mine. Marcus Webb disappeared from the industry for about a year, then resurfaced at a smaller company in a reduced role. I saw his LinkedIn updates occasionally. He'd reinvented himself as an organizational transformation consultant, advising companies on agile infrastructure strategies. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. Almost, but not quite. Because I knew there were companies out there that would hire him, that would listen to his recommendations, that would learn the same lessons Vertex had learned. The cycle would continue because companies kept believing that expertise was a cost to be minimized rather than an asset to be cultivated. I couldn't save all of them, but I could save some. Could help the ones who were willing to listen, who understood that the people who built their systems were worth more than the money they saved by getting rid of them. 3 years after Black Friday, I was invited to speak at a conference about technical leadership and organizational resilience. The organizers wanted me to tell the Vertex story, not as gossip or schadenfreude, but as a case study in what happens when companies undervalue their technical experts. I stood on that stage looking out at an audience of CTOs and VPs and engineering managers, and I told them about the 4 years I'd spent building something I was proud of, about the 18 months of watching it get undermined by someone who didn't understand it, about the 2 weeks of knowledge transfer that couldn't possibly capture what I knew, about the 4 hours and 23 minutes that cost $100 million and ended careers and taught lessons that should have been learned much earlier. The code wasn't held hostage, I said at the end. I gave them everything: documentation, architecture diagrams, operational runbooks. What I couldn't give them was the understanding that comes from building something over years, the intuition that knows something is wrong before the metrics show it, the relationships with team members who trust your judgment because you've earned that trust over time. I paused, looking out at the audience. When you treat your experts as legacy personnel, when you assume that anyone can be replaced with documentation and contractors, when you cut costs by eliminating the people who actually understand how things work, you're not optimizing. You're building a time bomb. And the explosion always comes at the worst possible moment, because that's when your systems are under the most stress. Marcus Webb didn't hold my code hostage. He just didn't understand that code without understanding is worthless. That infrastructure without the people who built it is just a disaster waiting to happen. After the talk, a woman approached me, early 40s, sharp-eyed, the look of someone who'd seen things and learned from them. I was at Vertex during Black Friday, she said. On the client side, one of the retailers who lost our biggest sales day because their systems failed. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. That must have been devastating. It was. We lost almost $2 million in sales. Had to lay off seasonal workers we'd already hired. It took us 2 years to fully recover. She paused. But I want to thank you. Thank me? For the lesson. We were about to do the same thing at my company. Bring in consultants, reduce our engineering team, modernize our infrastructure. After Black Friday, we changed course. Invested in our people instead of cutting them. Built knowledge management systems, created redundancy and expertise. Made sure no single person was a point of failure, but also made sure we valued the people who understood our systems. How did that work out? She smiled. We just had our best Black Friday ever. 0 downtime, record transactions, smoothest peak season in company history. Because we learned from watching what happened when you do it wrong. That's the thing about disasters. They're terrible while they're happening, but they're also teachers. They show you what matters, what you've been taking for granted, what you need to protect. Vertex learned that lesson the hard way. 4 hours and 23 minutes of chaos that cost more than any efficiency initiative could ever save. Their clients learned it. their competitors learned it, and maybe, just maybe, some of the companies that heard the story learned it without having to live through it themselves. I think about that Black Friday sometimes, about watching the status page turn red, knowing exactly what was happening and why, feeling that complicated mixture of vindication and horror and guilt. The vindication was obvious. I'd been right, they'd been wrong, and the proof was written in red status indicators and lost revenue and careers ended. But the vindication felt hollow, tasted like ash. Being right doesn't mean much when the thing you built is burning and you can't do anything to save it. The horror was for the people still there. Rachel and the other engineers, watching systems fail that they had warned about, knowing they'd be blamed even though they had done everything they could. The clients, losing their biggest sales day through no fault of their own. The seasonal workers at those retail companies who'd lose their jobs because the orders didn't come in. Disaster cascades outward, touching people who had nothing to do with the decisions that caused it. And the guilt, that was the hardest to process. I'd walked away. I'd given my 2 weeks and documented what I could and left, knowing that what remained wouldn't be enough. Could I have fought harder, stayed longer, found some way to force them to understand what they were losing? Maybe. Probably not. Marcus had made his decision. The board had backed him, and no amount of argument from me was going to change a course that had already been set. But the guilt remained anyway, the feeling that I should have done more, should have been more persuasive, should have found some way to prevent what happened. Time helps with guilt. Distance helps. Building something new, helping other companies avoid the same fate, that helps most of all. The guilt never quite goes away, but it transforms into something more useful, determination to make sure the lesson wasn't learned in vain. I didn't hold anyone's code hostage. I gave them everything I had, documented what I could, warned them about what was coming. They just didn't listen, didn't understand, didn't value what I knew until it was too late. The platform went down at peak hours. Not because I sabotaged it, not because I withheld information, but because the people who took over didn't understand what they had, didn't respect the complexity, the nuance, the years of accumulated knowledge that couldn't be captured in handoff documents. Some lessons can only be learned through loss. Vertex lost $100 million and a dozen clients and their CTO and their reputation. I lost a job and 4 years of work and the satisfaction of seeing something I built continue to succeed. But I also gained something, clarity about what I wanted, about how I wanted to work, about the value of what I knew, a consulting practice that helped other companies avoid the same mistakes. A reputation built on understanding that people and systems are inseparable, that you can't optimize one without destroying the other. He held my code hostage, except he didn't. He just didn't understand what he had, didn't value it until it was gone, didn't realize that the person who built something is often the only person who truly understands it. The platform went down at peak hours, and in the wreckage, I found something better than revenge. I found my value, finally and fully understood, not by them, by me. That's the lesson that matters. Not that they were wrong and I was right, but that expertise has value whether or not the people around you recognize it. That institutional knowledge is real even when it can't be documented. That the people who build things deserve to be treated as essential, not expendable. They learned it the expensive way. I learned it by walking away and building something new. Some lessons are worth $100 million. This one was worth more.